pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the Senior Leadership Fellows Program for the fall 2024. Thank you. All right. I am deeply, deeply honored to welcome all of you to this event. I want this to be more than a formal event, a conversation between 5 people who are going to be, 4 of them are going to be fellows. The 5th one, do we have Carlos online? We have a 5th fellow who couldn't be here, and he'll be joining us by Zoom in a couple of minutes, hopefully. Do we have Carlos ready? We should. All right. So my name is Carlos Diaz-Rosillo. I'm the founding director of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, which, as you know, is an independent, nonpartisan think and do tank that aims to inform, to influence, and to inspire current and future leaders to develop and implement innovative, meaningful, and effective public policies to advance individual and economic freedom and human prosperity in the United States, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and around the world. We were established, as many of you know, by the legislature and the governor of Florida 4 years ago to harness the power of rigorous research to offer a better understanding of the free enterprise system and its impact on individual freedom and human prosperity. Throughout our different activities, both the educational ones, the public ones, the research ones, we hope to inspire and enlighten policy discussions, analysis, and decision maker. The way I look at it, we have sort of three different buckets of things we do. Number one, education. We have an amazing educational program. The flagship program, the crown jewel, is the Senior Leadership Fellows Program, a program that brings to the center, to FIU, up until now 4, now 5 distinguished public servants who have served at the highest levels. We've always been privileged to have at least 1 former president, sometimes 2, former ministers, and now for the first time a sitting public servant, a sitting member of Congress. And they teach not-for-credit study groups. We hope to be able to offer bachelor's degrees, master's degrees. We do executive education, but the first bucket of things we do is education and mentorship. Second is advanced research and scholarship. We have a very active research program. Tomorrow we're going to launch the 4th edition of the Index of Bureaucracy right here. President Fox is going to join us. So this is an annual publication that looks at the bureaucratic hurdles that small businesses have to overcome to start a small business and to keep it going in 19 countries, 16 in Latin America, 3 in Europe, and we keep on growing. We have many other research programs. And third, we do public events just like this one that bring together people from all over the world to have thoughtful conversations about important matters facing Miami, Florida, the United States, and the world. So we're thrilled to be able to have this welcoming event with all these fellows who are going to start teaching their courses. In 2 cases, they started already, and in the other ones, they're going to start this week and next week. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the presence of the university's provost, Elizabeth Behar. Thank you, Madam Provost, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. And now, and President Guaido, of course. Thank you for joining us again. And the former First Lady, Marta de Fox. What a good husband. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly introduce each one of them, and I do emphasize briefly. They deserve a much longer introduction, but I'm just going to say a couple of lines about them, and then I'm going to ask each one of them a question related to their experiences, and then I'm going to open it up so that we can have a conversation where hopefully you can join in. And rather than just me asking each of you questions, you just jump in and have a meaningful, thoughtful conversation rather than an interview. So I'm going to begin with Vicente Fox. Vicente Fox, as you know, is the former president of Mexico. His presidency marked a significant shift in Mexico's political landscape as he introduced reforms that strengthened the country's democratic institutions and economy. As many of you know, Mexico was governed by one party, the PRI, for more than 70 years. And so he's the first president in Mexico's history to break that stronghold on Mexican democracy. During his tenure, Fox successfully controlled inflation and interest rates and achieved the lowest unemployment rate in Latin America. And his period was so successful that another member of his party, Partido de Acción Nacional, Margarita's husband, President Calderon, was elected for the period immediately after President Fox. Before becoming president, as many of you know, President Fox served as governor, and before entering politics, he worked in the private sector. He worked for Coca-Cola, where he quickly rose to become president of the company's operations in Mexico and in Latin America, helping Coca-Cola outpace its main competitor, Pepsi. Since leaving office, President Fox has remained an influential public figure, speaking internationally on various topics of interest. Thank you, President Fox, for being here. To my left, we have Félix Maradiaga, former Secretary General of the Ministry of Defense of Nicaragua. After an active career as a civic society leader, he ran for president of Nicaragua in 2021, and he was subsequently arrested and detained by the regime, becoming the third opposition candidate to be detained. Eventually, there will be 5. So the regime jailed every single one of the presidential candidates. As a Latin American leader, he's known for his work on nonviolent resistance and democracy building. He's one of the most influential voices within the Nicaraguan opposition and a prominent human rights activist. As president of the Foundation for the Freedom of Nicaragua, Maradiaga has been instrumental in raising awareness about political detainees through the campaign EndArbitraryDetention.org. Despite facing persecution, including arrest, as I mentioned, and 21 months of imprisonment under inhumane conditions for opposing the Ortega regime in Nicaragua, he continues to fight for democracy and human rights. He was expelled to the United States in 2023, along with 221 other political prisoners, and he remains a dedicated voice for his cause. He was recently, just a few months, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you. To my far right, we're very fortunate to have Martín Redrado, former president of the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic. Previously, he had served as senior economic advisor at the World Bank and worked at the WTO's Dispute Settlements Unit. He has also had leadership roles at the Bank for International Settlements and SEMLA. Earlier, he was Argentina's deputy foreign minister and headed the Securities and Exchange Commission. He currently leads Fundación Capital, an influential economic research and policy think tank in Argentina. Now we have on video Carlos, Ambassador Carlos Trujillo. Thank you, Carlos, for joining us. Carlos was the former U.S. permanent representative to the Organization of American States. In this role, he led the mission of the OAS, the world's oldest regional organization, and chaired key committees, including the Permanent Council and Budget Committees. Ambassador Trujillo was also appointed as a U.S. representative to the 72nd General Assembly of the United Nations, and he was later nominated by President Trump to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. Before his diplomatic career, Ambassador Trujillo was a state representative for Florida's 105th District and a founding partner of Trujillo, Vargas, Gonzalez, and Evia. In addition to his legal and political work, Ambassador Trujillo is the president of Continental Strategy and Demand Democracy Now!, and he manages real estate holdings in Coral Gables, Florida. Thank you, Ambassador. Where are you now?
Thank you for having me. I'm here in Washington, D.C. on a beautiful day.
Nice.
To see everyone.
Thank you. All right. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Margarita Zavala, member of Congress of Mexico and former First Lady of Mexico. She currently represents Mexico City's 10th district in the Chamber of Deputies of Mexico, a position she was first elected to in 2021 and to which she was re-elected in 2024, just a few months ago. My understanding is that you received the most votes out of any member of Congress of the opposition in Mexico. As a former independent presidential candidate herself in 2018, she founded the political organization Mexico Libre in 2019. Her political career began in 2003 when she was elected as a federal representative for the Partido de Acción Nacional. She then served as Mexico's First Lady from 2006 to 2012. A distinguished lawyer, she has worked in major law firms and has taught law at top universities in Mexico and now, of course, at FIU. Please help me give a warm round of applause to our fellows. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the first question of each of the fellows. And then I'm going to ask individual questions of them. We're going to be doing this for hopefully 40 minutes or so, and then I'm going to let you ask questions of the fellows. Feel free to ask the questions in English or in Spanish. I want to begin with you, President Fox. How did you get involved in this political mess? You're a successful entrepreneur, business leader, and then you decide to run for office, governor and then president. Why?
First of all, I'm really honored to be here with you to have this dialogue. My respects to Señor Guaidó, the heroes that are fighting now in Latin America, like him, Nicaragua, and the rest. Things are becoming more and more difficult each time for democracy, for freedom, and for a respect to the rule of law. So what brought me into this? I'm Jesuit educated. And what I learned there and was printed in my head is that the shortcut to happiness is being for others, is doing for others. And what best arena to participate in than the Mexico of authoritarian government, autocrat government for 71 years, and the country having more and more problems in its way into development. So I decided to move out of the private sector and get into the public sector. But one other thing I learned with the Jesuits is that once you have a purpose, you know where you're heading, you get there. You just get there. And so I decided when I moved from business to politics that I would have become governor of my state without anybody else knowing of my decision. And finally, I made it. And I made it with my cowboy boots, my blue shirt, my jeans, and speaking the common language that people speak and expresses themselves with, which was not the language of the PRI. Very sophisticated, very high class, very powerful, very dominant. And so coming with humbleness and speaking the language of the people is what brought me to success. Then I became governor of the states after one election that was annihilated because there was a huge cheating on it. Fraud, electoral fraud, like is a general practice in Mexico. So I decided to reveal, and I went and took highways. I went and took the airport in our place in Guanajuato. So I promoted a movement to force government to recognize my win in that election. But they did not. So we had to press further. And finally, it was accepted only by running a second election afterwards that I won 3-1 on that second election. So there was no fraud capable of denying what people did decide. Then I ran for becoming president of Mexico. I decided to resign after 4 years of governor and ran for the presidency. But again, Jesuit education taught me, if you want to get there and you put all your capacities, you will get there. So again, it was my decision, internal, reserved, but I made it to the presidency of Mexico. This all happened within 15 years, all together. So I'm extremely fulfilled, happy that I decided to go into public service, because maybe the number one aspiration to serve others could be being a priest, but I didn't like that, although that's what my mother wanted, me to become a priest. So I decided the second best was to be in government and do things for people. And that's what made me happy, what made me accomplish my dreams. And so afterwards, year 2006, Martha and I retired from public service, and today we have 3 nonprofits, 3 foundations, again, looking for that dream of doing for others. So 3 nonprofits, or the 3 foundations, work for the poor, work for those who don't have opportunities, and we keep on working after our big dream. I'm 82 now. I think I'm gonna be another 82 years yet around, because that's what technology is bringing to us. I just had a full reinvention of myself just 3 months ago. Now I have a de estos del corazón, ¿cómo se llama?
Pacemaker.
Un pacemaker. Now I have 4 of my arteries with small balloons inflated within them. So now they are open. And here I am, ready to, as I said, be another 82 years. And if I reincarnate, and with this I'll finish, I would not go to politics again. Never. I would stay on the private sector, private business, much easier to do, much easier to produce and generate wealth. So reincarnating on the private sector will be my desire for next life. Thank you.
So thank you. So again, I want to put into context what President Fox accomplished, right? For 71 years, the same party ruled Mexico. Elections every 6 years, candidate after candidate, from 1929 until 2000, candidates of the same party. And then here he comes, and is the first candidate in Mexico's history, really, to break that 71-year stronghold. And he succeeded by somebody else from his own party, so pretty big accomplishment that I think history will judge very, very positively. Staying in Mexico, Congresswoman, you also have a very impressive career. Yes, you do, of course. You're the first fellow. We've had one fellow before who started as a sitting government official for about 3 weeks when his term was over. Then he was a former, in this case, Attorney General. But you are a current member of Congress, right? Right now, you have responsibilities as a member of Congress in Mexico. As I mentioned, you received more votes than any member of the opposition. How did you get started in this mess?
Well, thank you very much. I will try to speak in English, but my English is so bad, and I prefer Spanish, but Carlos didn't tell me, and I am going to speak in English. Then it's not my responsibility about my language. Well, I am the 5th of the family. We are 7. I am the 5th. And I received as President Fox, he was a great candidate. Bueno, por instance, I don't know cómo es, hermano, por asuntos. We share the same political party, and I really admire him, his manner to fight. It's an honor to me to be here. And thank you, Carlos. Well, I am the 5th of 7 siblings, and my family gave me, particularly my mom and my dad, gave me a very social education, very to serve people, to do some for the others. And I, they taught me that you have to love country. To love to love Mexico it was as breathe. Respirar? Breathe. It's like a breathe. It's natural. You have to love your country, and you have to do something for your country. And I think the politic is the best manner to do some for the others, to build good common good, to build the common good that, and for that I started to look politic groups when I was 16 years old, and I saw a very good candidate for governor of Guanajuato, and I met Marta, because she was a candidate too, Marta Sagun. I know that I have to choose which group or which political group or which party I have to work, and I choose the PAN, and I learned a lot about democracy, and now I am really a fighter for the freedom and for democracy, and I love Mexico not only because I am a Mexican, because the history of Mexico, and I know a lot of I know a lot of my country, and I think it's one of the best consejos que era the best advice. If you want to work for your country, you have to know about your country, about your people, about the history, about the truth, la verdad, the truth of your country. And for that, I am in politics, and I not regret. I get a boyfriend and my husband in politics. That's true. And I'm really happy. And in my class and my life, I want to share for the young people how to love politics, to help the others.
Thank you. I think one of the things that the students who are in the Congresswoman's class are going to realize is just how humble she is. I first met her 24 years ago when her husband began his master's degree. We were students together. And she is the same person that you were 24 years ago when you were not First Lady yet, when he was not a presidential candidate. He had been the president of the party, but I think one of the things that you're going to realize is just how humble she is, and she really sold herself short. She's really, really amazing. Félix, you really had it rough, right? You decided to do something for your country, and you were jailed 21 months in inhumane conditions. Why get into this mess knowing that it's a rough sport?
People tend to joke that in Nicaragua we like baseball and politics, and it's not actually true. There are some countries, if we remember that famous quote from Otto von Bismarck, that produce more history than the history that we can consume. So we're a small country about the size of the state of New York in the middle of Central America, but we've had several civil wars. And since I was a child, I had this question that followed me through my younger years about the suffering of the people, why people couldn't keep their property. My grandfather was a great entrepreneur, someone that built a very successful business out of nothing, and he lost everything after the Sandinista revolution. My mother, an incredible entrepreneur, also had her property and her business confiscated. That was actually my very first traumatic experience, seeing my mother's business being taken away by something that was called MICOIN, el Ministerio de Comercio Interior. My grandfathers on my mother's side, farmers losing their property as well. So my mother made the most difficult decision a mother can make. She said, I don't want you to be a communist. And she'd rather send me to the US as part of the first wave of unaccompanied minors towards the United States, because she had a brief visit to the U.S. when she was actually studying to almost become a nun. So she had come to the U.S., and without knowing, she had this sense that there was this very powerful idea of freedom and respect of individual dignity and private property. And she said, as much as it hurts for me, I don't want you to be part of that. And I was already 11 years old, and even at a private school, I was already, learning all these leftist and communist, poems that were forced through the education system. And this is just a footnote on that. I met Margarita when your husband was the president of the G20, and we had a wonderful conversation, and that speaks about your heart. When I shared my story together with my wife, Berta, who's also Berta is over there. Hola. And we share with Margarita, both of us, our experience as refugees. And I remember you sharing your passion as First Lady for refugees and migrants. So in my case, it comes from the migrant experience, from having been forced to leave your community, your family, precisely because someone in power is running the country not for the common good, as you clearly said, but for the self-interest of a rotten political ideology. So even without knowing, I became very vocal as a teenager against the ideas of Sandinismo. And fast forward many years, I went back to Nicaragua as soon as the revolution was over. I went into a public service, became briefly a diplomat working for the UN for some time. And I knew that if I went into Nicaraguan politics, it was going to be an extremely rough game against Ortega. And at that time, we were at the same school in Cambridge. You know that town. It's almost like a bubble, about to start a doctoral program a few years. And then I get this call from my former student saying, Daniel Ortega is about to win the elections. We need someone to go back. So I went back to Nicaragua to try to start a political movement when it was not very popular. And so now, today, being among giants such as President Fox and, of course, Margarita and many of you, it's a humbling experience. But I would say that in my case, it was a completely unexpected journey based out of the open wounds of a child who saw his mother's property being taken away. My father, who passed away when I was very young, I was only 8, he was 32 years old, but I had been a student on scholarship in Chile in the 1970s. He never got himself involved in politics, he never became part of any political party, but just because of being a member of a student group in Chile, he was in prison in the 70s, and he never recovered from torture in the 70s. So I know what extremism can do on the name of the far right or the name of the far left. And at the end of the day, politics is exactly what you would say. So I will use your words. It's about the common good. It's about the service of those who cannot speak. As a member of the Nicaraguan community, I see some Nicaraguans over here who have suffered a lot, and I see every platform that I have as an opportunity to speak for those who do not have a voice. And I would say that out of the same Catholic tradition that we were ingrained as children, we understand politics as an act of service.
Thank you, Felix. So, Martin, your time in public service is a little different. You're an economist. You've had a lot of technical positions. Right. You become president of the central bank of a country that has consistently been in crisis. But during your time as president, right, the whole world was in economic crisis. Right. And you enter politics in a very interesting way because you have a pretty vocal clash with the president of Argentina at the time, Cristina Fernandez. Tell us about your experience in public service and what led you to go from an economist to a person that not only affected the economy of your country, but in many ways, a politician yourself.
Well, thank you. Yeah, in my case, I went into public service because of the concept of change. I want to add to what has been very well said, that when you go into public service is the idea of serving, or the concept of serving your people. But really it was born with frustration that there is a story going around in Argentina that there are 4 types of countries: the developed countries, the developing countries, Argentina and Japan. The developed and developing world, we know very well the capacities of both. Japan, as you know, has nothing, has no natural resources, has very small island as compared to other countries, and it has become a great economic power. And Argentina has everything, blessed with natural resources, no racial problems, but the output has been very weak, to say in a very diplomatic way, but it has been, unfortunately, a history of failures. So my coming into public service was this concept of change, and how can you make a change? You know, we have been preceded by very strong politicians in Latin America. I believe that to come into electoral politics, you need to have something here in your guts, which I don't have. So I really admire what has been said. But I really have a passion for change that you could do also as a political appointee, and that was the case. In my case, my first experience was a very interesting one, because I did my MBA at Harvard University and took some courses, obviously in the economics department. And at that point, a young professor, Jeffrey Sachs, was there with the right ideas at that time, I would say. At that time. And this was the 80s. And a group of former students of Harvard went back to Harvard to have advice for the first democratic elected president, Victor Paz Tensoro. And so Jeff Sachs had asked in the class, who speaks Spanish? And there were 3 guys who speak Spanish. So we were not very knowledgeable about economics, but we were chosen as, remember at that time, Mr. Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada was the planning minister of Victor Paz Tensoro. He called us, at that point there was a series in TV called The Angels, well, we were called Sachs Angels because we were 3. There was a Mexican friend who unfortunately didn't go into public service, but he had a very distinguished career in the private sector, Goldman Sachs and so forth. His name is Allen Sanginés Krause. The second one is a Chilean guy, Felipe Larraín, who became, as you know, twice economic minister. And the third is your friend here. So we went in 1986 to deal with hyperinflation in Bolivia. And to make story short, we worked there for 2 years, coming back and forth. And then when hyperinflation hit in Argentina in 1989, then, people began to see who were experts in hyperinflation. So they said, well, Martin has worked here. And at that time, President Menem looked for different economists, and he looked for Mr. Cavallo, who was also a Harvard graduate. And Mr. Cavallo said, I need you to work, particularly in the financial sector. And he called me back to take my first public service office as president of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1991. So then, then I went, after that, I founded Fundación Capital in 1995 as a research organization in economics, dealing with all of Latin America. There we specialized in following the economy of Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. I also had, Argentina has been unfortunately a very isolated country. We grew under the idea that we could become self-sufficient by just our own natural resources. So we were not very much integrated to the world economy. So I did have also a passion for international issues. So I was called upon after the crisis of 2002 to become Deputy Foreign Minister. And as that, I was the chief trade representative of Argentina at that point. We opened 8 different negotiations. The first one was in 2002 with Mexico to open the car market between our 2 countries, doing the first free trade agreement. We have an organization in Latin America called ALADI, which allows you to do bilateral agreements besides what is called Mercosur, which is our trade, not very successful trade union that we have with Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The first one was with Mexico. I recall it was the first exchange of 50,000 cars at zero trade tariff. It was a very good trade minister, Mr. Derbez, at that point. And then I became elected fortunately by Congress to be president of the central bank. And as you said, Carlos, I was very independent from the organization until I gathered $50 billion in the Central Bank of Argentina in a very independent way, carrying monetary policy. I'm sure we're going to speak about what we're going to discuss in study groups, so I leave that. But as you said very well, I had to steer my country through the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And it was the first time that Argentina didn't suffer a crisis because we have done buffers to basically weather through. I will speak about that later. But when the president saw $50 billion there, she wanted to grab. And I said, Madam, these are of the people. These 50 billion are neither yours nor mine. I'm simply administering in the best way, but this is the reserves of the currency of the country. So she decided to fire me with a decree. I went to courts, and the courts reinstated me in office. And then it became, this was January of 2010, and this became a sort of political infight. I didn't want it to be, but I just said, Madam, if you want to take the reserves, you need to change the law. You cannot do it just by a decree that you sign and you grab the 50 billion. And so the court reinstated me. I made my case in front of Congress, but it became a very strong, I made my case in terms of saying, this is not the way you go, but clearly I didn't want to make it an institutional fight in Argentina, and I decided that the best way to serve my country was to resign, but make the case public in front of Congress. This was not the way to do it. Unfortunately, the president that followed me did twist her arm and gave out the reserves of the central bank. As a result of that, I wrote a book that became a bestseller in Argentina called No Reserves, because I told, unfortunately, madam, if you follow that path, you will end up with a central bank which is going to be empty. And that also became published in English by Amazon. I published 6 books. This was my 4th, and it was the one that was published in English. So it became a story of independence of central bank, of how you defend institutions. And then I continued my career at the World Trade Organization, at the World Bank, also trying to help other countries. And I also had a master's in central banking in the Asia Business School in Kuala Lumpur, trying to teach others. And I always keep as a, basically media is very important. So I became basically a referral in media to try to put what is a word of where is the future laying for, especially Latin America, not only for Argentina. So the concept of change, unfortunately, because of my country, has been a country of economic failure. That's why I study economics. And the concept of service, and the concept of always standing by principle. President Fox was very clear in terms of being a Jesuit, and I would say principle is really what matters. And I recall that when I stood in front of the President of Argentina confronting her, I received a letter from the Secretary of the Treasury at that time of the United States, Tim Geithner, and it said, Martin, you're a guy of principle. And I think principle is what really matters in public service.
Thank you, Martin. So I'm getting a theme here of Jesuit-educated public servants, and to continue that, Carlos, Ambassador Trujillo, another Jesuit-educated public figure, you've been both an elected official and an appointed official. You began your career as a state rep at a very young age, in your 20s. Why did you become involved in public service?
Well, thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be with all of you all in this distinguished forum. And I think the Jesuit education, as President Fox said, and others have mentioned, I know Carlos and I share the same high school and middle school. it really influences that passion of service for others, right? Our school's mascot or motto is always men for others. And I think you really try to encompass that in your life on how purpose in life is public service. Really, me personally, you do everything in your life to try to honor God and get closer to God. And public service helps you, I think, down that path for many, many people. So I think it was really, really influential in my early years. My first public service was actually being a prosecutor in Miami-Dade County. So I spent 4 years down in Miami once I graduated from law school, prosecuting cases from DUIs to murders. And it was a very challenging time professionally, but also very, very rewarding. And during that time in that public service, you start, obviously, you're very in tune with the Florida legislature and the Florida Penal Code and many other things. And it really started to cement this idea that we could do better, right, on a lot of things, whether it's juvenile delinquency, whether it's dependency, whether it's minimum mandatories on criminal offenses. We could do a lot better. And that inspired me really to run for public office at that time for a seat in the State House of Representatives. And I did that for 8 years. Subsequent to that, I had the opportunity to be nominated and appointed by President Trump to serve as an ambassador at the Organization of American States, and was able to do that through the end of his term. But it's just very, very rewarding that you use your God-given talents to help others, and you really focus all the gifts that God's given you to try to make other people's lives just a little bit better, and really contribute to these strong democracies that in our country and many of the countries on the stage, you've had the opportunity to really enjoy. Similar to Felix, right? You do the best you can, and you pray to God that the outcome is democracy and not totalitarianism. And I think if more and more good people lend themselves for the public forum, the better off society will be.
Thank you, Carlos. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst political system in the world, except for every other one. And so another one of the themes is, the importance of democracy. One of the reasons why we have seen certain amount of weakness in Latin American democracies is because a lot of people have not seen the results, right? Democracy is messy. It's the best system, but it's messy. And for democracy to work, people have to see results. And whether you're from the left or from the right, we have to acknowledge that in many cases, democracy hasn't really given a sense of hope to people on the ground. We have 4 countries represented on the stage, in Nicaragua, in Mexico, and in the United States, you have governments on the left. In Argentina, you have a government on the right. And I want to begin with a question for each about what's happening in your countries, both politically and economically. And I want to begin with Argentina, because it's so different what's happening in Argentina from the rest of the other countries. And so 2 questions for you. One is, can you give us a sense of what's happening in Argentina? President Milei has been in office for a few months. How is he doing? Is there hope? How's the economy doing? Can you give us a just brief assessment of what's happening in Argentina? And a second question is, President Milei has said that we should get rid of the central bank. You were president of the central bank. Is he wrong?
One thing is what you say in a campaign, another is what you do when you govern. And let me start by the last question, your last part. I know the economic team very well, and they are working to keep the central bank. And also he's spoken about, well, dollarization, which was one of the key ideas in his campaign. But let me pick up on your first comment, Carlos. Unfortunately, and I will speak only for Argentina, we've had democracy since 1983, as you are aware. And unfortunately, what you have is that politicians have got richer, and the population has got poorer and poorer and poorer. So one of the reasons why Milei is president is the failure of the political class. Clearly, people, what my sense, if I can understand or transmit what was the feeling in the Argentinian society, was a feeling is, we are fed up with all of you. We are fed up with, all the people that have governed. I don't want to make names, but we are fed up. We want to try something different. And as you know, Mr. Milei's history is really a phenomenon, no? Because he was very vocal in his TV participations, and he brought, he was also very strong in terms of his positions, against the status quo, against the political establishment. And so in 2021, he became congressman with, only 2 congressmen, with the vice president now, and he became president. And I think that clearly he brought the concept of change, and clearly he brought the concept is, I'm different. I'm different from all the political class that has been governing Argentina. So how has he been doing? I think he has one main idea as an economist, which clearly has a lot of praise. And if you say, why has Argentina has done so poorly? Well, there are a lot of reasons. But let me simplify that, and I agree with what the first concept that President Milei has. In the last 126 years, we only have 6 years with fiscal surplus. That is to say, if you want to explain why Argentina has done so badly, it has been a history of overspending and over-indebtedness. And when you indebt yourself, you indebt in the local markets, you indebt in the international markets, and as you know, unfortunately, we had one of the biggest defaults in history in 2001. Or you indebt yourself by printing money from the central bank. And that was the concept that Mr. Milei had, is I want to get rid of this money-making machine. So he has become, and he has given the president, the current president of the central bank, total independence, that there is no financing, zero financing, which was the opposite before. Before, we went up to almost 6% of GDP, public sector deficit, which was only financed by the central bank, just printing money. So no wonder why Argentina had 220% inflation by December of last year when President Milei took office. So his main accomplishment has been, I am going to fight for fiscal surplus no matter what. So that is one of the things that he has accomplished systematically. And what you could say as an economist or also as a politician is, man, to turn a 5% fiscal deficit to 0 or to almost a small surplus like Argentina now has is impossible. He made it. And he made it consistently. Every month, Argentina has been performing with fiscal surplus. So that is probably his main accomplishment. Clearly, as you say, Carlos, what is out there is the results. Of course, Argentina has gone in the first month through a very strong recession. The GDP is going to, we're going to have a drop of 3.7% of GDP. Poverty in my country is 52%. Okay, 52% of the population is below the poverty line. So you ask, how come a country with those natural resources, with no racial problems, has this? So now he has to deliver on this. He has to include, and as you say, he has to bring results to show hope to the people that are in front, to see that there is obviously having a fiscal surplus is what I call a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. In order to, he needs to show where is the path of growth. Argentina has several options at this point in terms of what the world is demanding from our region, in terms of energy security, energy transition, and food security, and food traceability, in particular with what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Ukraine, and the tension that you have also in the China Sea looking forward. So there are a number of spots which, in my view, give an opportunity to Latin America and in particular to Argentina. So bottom line, Carlos, he's trying to turn the wheels of a history of failure. He has accomplished one thing, and I think he's going to maintain this commitment to surplus. Now he has to deliver in terms of a development strategy for Argentina that will give a horizon to people to how to get out of a recession. However, I have to say that given that he has made a very strong, austere plan, he still has around 48, 50% of the population that is supporting him. And that is really some kind of accomplishment, because when you do that type of fiscal adjustment, as he has done, you can say that, and also I have to say that he's in a minority. He is a minority in Congress. He has only 38 congressmen out of 257, and only 8 senators out of 272 senators. So he is really proving to be also an able politician, and also, of course, a very, very strong, spearheaded economist with very strong principles. But that's the challenge. The challenge is not only to deliver a fiscal surplus, but to deliver a path of growth that Argentina, and sustainable growth that will include all of the population.
Thank you. Latin American history is filled with pretty lousy leaders. Right now, in my opinion, there's 3 that stand out: Ortega, Maduro, Díaz-Canel. Tell us what's happening in Nicaragua. Ortega has been incredibly resilient in clinging to power. Is there hope for the opposition? We just had elections, as you know, and all the opposition was wiped out. Is there hope in Nicaragua?
Yes, I will start by saying that we can lose all battles, but there's one battle we cannot lose, it's the battle of hope. And it's precisely because the natural tendency of every human being, it's not oppression, it's freedom. And of course, the Sandinista regime is a machine. They've captured the state of Nicaragua. They fully captured all the institutions back in 1979. And of course, I'm not trying to deviate the attention from the own self-responsibility of Nicaraguans, but I must say that the international community, the Latin American community, fell into the trap of socialism in 1979, and the Sandinistas were never democratic. They knew what they wanted to do. It was a Cuban project designed from Havana in 1979, and I would say that now it sounds, very controversial, but I will openly say that what President Reagan, what Pope John II did in the 1980s is what the world is lacking today, basically. And the Sandinista is a party, and Ortega in particular is a relic of the Cold War. And what we're seeing is not only Ortega as an individual entity, but as a project that now includes China, includes Iran, includes Russia. And of course, Nicaragua is a small state, so it's very easy to capture, particularly when you have divided opposition. So I will briefly say some of the elements of the current condition of Nicaragua. Close to 18% of the population has been forced into exile. Ortega has declared stateless over 400 Nicaraguans, but in practice, over 3,000 Nicaraguans have been forced into exile. Family members, my own wife and I, were declared stateless. So it's not only the fact that our passport was taken away, but the fact that we cannot even exercise our own nationality. But on top of that, extrajudicial killings, the use of prison as a political weapon. Now, in terms of the economy of the country, there's a paradox there, because when you have such an immense amount of Nicaraguans being forced into exile, of course, we are hardworking people. We tend to go to Costa Rica or Spain or the US, and guess what? Nicaraguans are hardworking. They work and they care about the families left behind, so they send their money in the forms of remittances. So now Nicaragua has 28% of its GDP in remittances. So for those of you who are economists, you will know that's probably a world record. It used to be Jamaica with 24%. Just to give you this in comparative numbers, this is 5 times what we produce in coffee. It's 4 times what we produce in gold. So it's $5 billion a year of free money that does not come from the energy, the resources, the capital of the land of Nicaraguans, but for the sweat and tears and blood of Nicaraguans forced into exile around the world. So and that's what keeps Ortega right now, the economy running.
So how do you turn that, and how do you turn that hope into a strategy to bring democracy back to Nicaragua?
Well, in our case, the strategy is a combination of a number of factors. And I know that I want to give the other colleagues an opportunity, but briefly, number one, Ortega is not a domestic problem. That's point number one. The world needs to understand that Ortega, it's a problem. I was just giving an interview a few minutes ago, remembering that when there was the first terrorist attack against the Twin Towers, there was passports of Nicaragua granted by the Sandinistas to the terrorists. So Ortega is linked to global terrorism. That's number one. So the world needs to understand that we need global solidarity. We cannot do things alone. We need the solidarity of the world. That's number one. Number two, we need internal resistance. So we're trying to use as many methods. Of course, I cannot speak publicly about that, But one of the reasons, and I will say this very openly, why I have not accepted any other nationality is because my daily job is to persuade the world to help me to go back to Nicaragua and continue to lead the Nicaraguan struggle for freedom inside Nicaragua. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is that this is a human rights issue. We need to activate international mechanisms of the criminal court against Ortega, and we need to declare the Sandinista Party as a terrorist organization. And that's a very important point number 3. And number 4, using international sanctions, particularly to hit Ortega on his wallet.
Thank you, Felix. There's no question, regardless of your political ideology, there's no question that what's happening in Mexico, right, is pretty extreme. You had a president that for 6 years remained highly popular, left office with over 60% popularity, re-elected his hand-picked successor, who won with almost 30 percentage points over the opposition. Question for both of you. What's happening in Mexico? We've had a very serious judicial reform that went through Congress, and it was, in a matter of months, it was approved with very little debate. Mexico is our biggest trading partner, our neighbor to the south, something that's very concerning to all Americans, of course. What's happening?
Margarita says that I go first. Bueno, complicated to answer to that question. First of all, why Latin America has been such a huge failure anywhere. Maybe except Chile today, but it still is far away from Korea or from Taiwan or from even the tigers of Asia. Why Latin America is where we are today. Even Africa has rates of growth faster than Latin America. I don't know where are we going to end our story in Latin America. We have many explanations. We have done all the efforts that you can account for, and yet there we are, way far behind. So what's going on? We say maybe democracy is the key to development. It is not. Really, democracy is not working well in Latin America. Democracy is questioned most everywhere in Latin America. You have stories like the one in Venezuela, like the one in Cuba, like the one in Nicaragua, like the one in Colombia today that was doing so great until they became and have a government that is populist, that came out of a guerrilla. And maybe we should ask ourselves, who is mistaken? Are we sure that open markets, that trading, that democracy, that freedom is the way to go? And I end up questioning most of the answers. Maybe the only one good answer that explains why we don't move could be what I always repeat. There is only one way you can make a nation prosper, and it's only through education. Maybe that is our talón de Achilles, because if we see our degrees of school on the average, we're way behind. If we look at the quality of our education in most of our countries, if you wanted to do the worst educational system, is the one we have. The union controlling education, governments ideologizing education. When we have a socialist government, then they come in to include most of the socialist principles. If we have a close to communist government, then we get what they proposed, and they included it on our textbooks. So I really question how are we going to move ahead. If we talk about deficit that he was saying, even having a central bank, look at United States. There's no other country with such a huge deficit as the one that this country has. So having deficits is not the worst that can happen to you. Usually in businesses, we get loans, we get credits, and we make good use of them. And if we are paying 12% interest rate, we make 25% return on our money in businesses. But in politics, it's not. When I came into politics, I had my own dream because I came from the Coca-Cola company, where everything was discipline, everything was planning, everything was performing, everything was efficiency, quality, and else and else. And I thought all those instruments and those tools would work in government. And I started using them, and everybody started laughing at me. And I had to withdraw a little bit because I was minority government. Yes, I defeated the PRI after 71 years, but only to a certain extent, because I was minority in Congress, both chambers. I was minority in the number of governments at the state level. I was huge minority on the municipal level. So then you start negotiating. There's no other alternative. And you come to Congress and say, this is what I present to you. We should do highways here. We should do cross highways from the Pacific to the Gulf. We should do highways from northern border to southern border. We should build the schools here and there. We should move on higher education. And everything was rejected. What Congress is always looking for is individual benefits for individual congressmen. And that happens there, and it happens here. What we call corruption in our countries, you call it lobbying here. But it's the same thing. You have to give gifts. You have to give support to others. So again, what's what we need in Latin America? Because I've been long enough to see that we're not performing. On the contrary, we're just on the defensive side, trying to get rid of dictators, trying to get rid of authoritarian governments, trying to get rid of populist governments. And we don't accomplish that task before we could start building on positive terms. So I would like to leave that question here. Maybe the students here in this such a fantastic university with such beautiful buildings, with such great faculty. I hope they can generate students that will come like the Chicago boys came to Chile long time ago. And guess who brought them? The only one that could do that in Latin America. A dictator, Pinochet. He brought him. And that was the start of Chile moving faster than the rest of us in Latin America. This country has its best asset in its university systems. Not even your army is good enough as your universities are. What an envy is on my side. Because yeah, we can claim we have National University of Mexico in Mexico with 300,000 students. And they perform, but way far behind what others perform. So education up to higher levels, if we look at Korea, 85% of the students titled from a university. In Mexico, 29% of the students titled from a university. The rest don't get there. The rest are staying way behind. And Mexico is supposed to have a pretty good education system. I don't know where the others are. If we go to Cuba, Castro claims, because I had many conversations with him, that they had the best education system in the world. Maybe basic school, same as he claimed that they had the best medical system in Cuba than anywhere else in Latin America. Jesus Christ, I mean, when I saw what they had, impossible. So, question is, what the hell are we going to do? Organized crime has control of half of Mexico's nation today. So we had a very lousy president with López Obrador, terrible, the worst we have ever had. But crime is worse than he is. What are we going to do with that? Nobody wants to fight them. This President López Obrador came in and said, abrazos, no balazos. Nothing happened on 6 years, and organized crime started controlling the nation. And where do organized crime get their money? Right here, in this nation. In this nation, by selling drugs, by bringing all the drugs that are consumed in this, the largest drug market in the world is here. And we question ourselves, we say, okay, we can get some migrants in, and we do a lot of that. But we get a lot of drugs here that come through Mexico, coming from Venezuela, coming from Nicaragua, coming from Ecuador, and they reach this nation, and that's where they get the money back and the arms back, and we suffer what we have there. Maybe I should add, just to finish, one more thing that you need besides education. It's leadership. One leader can change the world by its own will and its own determination. If he has a purpose, he will make it. We've seen how leaders like Martin Luther King, like Nelson Mandela, like Mahatma Gandhi, like the guy there in Poland, just one man changed the world. And we don't finish having that man or that lady in Latin America to change the world. So leadership is a power we all have within. And if we have a strong purpose, we will reach that purpose. Maybe it's that we're missing in Latin America, leadership. But you can have two sides of leadership. One is evil leadership, like those dictators, like the stupid criminal Maduro, that we cannot defeat him, and he laughs at all of us, and we keep fighting, and he goes to his palace and enjoys life, and speaks fluently, and laughs at all of us. We tried hard to avoid having López Obrador in Mexico, and we just couldn't. I was supposed to be the great man that defeated the priest 71 years after. I tried every single second of his administration to get him out, to throw him out of national parliament, and we couldn't. And maybe we could be wrong on what we call our assets, our capacities. Look at China. China is run like a corporation, international corporation, with a CEO, which is the president, with a 5-year plan, which is followed strictly to the most profound detail. And they progress and they moved. They have created over 300 million middle classes families in China. Not even this nation could do it. Only 200, 250 in 200 years. China made it in 30 years. So I wish we can get inspiration from universities like Chicago, like this university or others, or maybe improve our level of education from the 29 kids that have a title and the other 71 are out there in poverty without opportunities. Even in Mexico, that is supposed to be so successful. So I'm sorry that I don't bring a very positive message to this table. But we need a shake-up. We need to stop telling stories and really building progress and building development. And more than anything else, education, education, education. If we can title 80 or more % like Korea did, or those, we could move ahead. I don't have any doubts.
And that is exactly what we're trying to do at the center, right? Provide students with the tools they need to become better leaders, so that what you just described doesn't happen again. Congresswoman, same question, and I'll emphasize something. I agree with the president's assessment of the former president, President López Obrador, yet he left office incredibly popular, and his handpicked successor was elected with almost 60% of the vote, and the closest one was 30.
Correction, not extremely popular, 60%. I was 64% when I ended up. Cedillo was 70% when he finished. Calderón ended up over and above 60. So this guy knows how to sell his narrative. He's a lousy.
But his handpicked successor was elected 60% of the vote, and the closest competitor, who was the candidate of the PRI, the PRAN, the PRD, everybody else combined, got 30%. Why? I mean, again, I agree with the assessment, lousy president, but then his party overwhelmingly wins. Why?
Well, first of all, without a doubt, Mexico is living under a populist regime. Really populist, and it's not important if you are the left or the right, it's a populist. And he spread a lot of money instead to invest of public service, for example.
Handouts.
And, what?
Handouts.
Handouts, exactly. And he spread really a lot of money. For any people, you have to receive a lot of money in each family. Even you don't have a highways, you don't have public service, a good public services, you have better income for that moment. And he has, but the government of Mexico has a lot, how do you say operadores, like
Local operators.
political operatives, but by paying by the government, of course, not by him, by their party. For that, it's very difficult to fight against him or his candidates because they receive a lot of money, and they threat them: if you don't vote for me, you doesn't going to receive the money. And it was very difficult, the very advantage in the process, in the electoral process. And I'm really sure that we have a lot of challenge about education. I think Tari told me that we need a school of citizens. Can you say that? A school of citizens.
Citizen formation.
Exactly. When Vicente Fox won, he knows that we have a lot of meeting about democracy, about how to be a good citizen, and we love that activity. I really worry because each month, each day, each month, each year, we are losing liberties. We are losing freedom of speech. Actually, in this month, October, in the September and October, 31 public editorialists, pero ¿cómo dice? Líderes de opinión. Opinion leaders resign, had to resign in the social media because somebody asked for their resign. And particularly the people who are supporting liberty, freedom, democracy. And each day, each month, each year is like a poison. And he using a lot hate speech, a lot, since the power, each day. And it's very difficult to live, and it's very difficult to fight. Is you awake, and the president started to say something against you and your family, and your manner of think, and of your politic party, of everything. And for that, I think he became to be like a popular, but the reason is the miedo, the fear of the people. And I'm really worried because the lack of rule of law in Mexico I think is the biggest problem. And it doesn't matter for the government. It doesn't matter. They prefer to work to win the next election than to work for the people. I'm really worried because in terms of the economy dates, they are hidden the old date, the date that show us that we don't have a good way for economy to grow. And the other thing that we are, it's not important for the democracy, maybe not for democracy, for the votes. And the populists are looking all the time for the votes, not for the life, not for the common good, not for build a community. And that was happening in Mexico all the time. For example, we are discussing in the Congress about supposed judicial reform, and really this government revoking the judicial power, and it's against of the división de poderes, the division of powers, and against of course of legacy, and against of democracy, and against of justice. I wanted to share that just on Saturday, this Saturday, October 12th, we suffered a massive dismissal of all judges, more than 1,700.
So all judges were let go.
Yes, because they have to resign because we're going to elect popular election to assign the judge people, and it is really, ¿cómo se dice ese golpe de estado? It's a coup d'etat against the judicial power, against democracy. Es más, we have a judicial discipline court he created to review all actions of the next judges. in the first year, and it can be a really judicial power. For that, we are landing in a dictatorial system. Even we have one president or another. We are in an autocratic system, I'm really sure.
And the problem is, as President Fox mentioned, when he was president, he did not have majorities in Congress, and he had an independent judiciary. What you have now is a president who has huge majorities in Congress, and the judiciary
Yes, actually, we are
being checked.
all opposition. We have 136 deputies among 500. But they don't want that kind of percentage of the Congress. I hope I can explain. Morena is the official
ruling party.
the ruling party, and Morena and the coalition of Morena won 54% of the votes. But in the Congress, they have 74% of the Congress. And they really robó, stole, robó a lot of deputies. Ellos no ganaron la mayoría calificada. Ellos no ganaron, y perdón que lo diga en español, porque realmente ahí hay una causa enorme. Se robaron un porcentaje del Congreso, no ganaron el 74%. Imagínense las instituciones que hacen de un 54% el 74% en una Cámara de Diputados. Even that, we have to fight. We have to be brave, and we have to win them, and we have to be to get a democracy for Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you. So speaking of fighting, nobody in the U.S. government fought harder to help bring democracy to Nicaragua, to Cuba, to Venezuela than Ambassador Trujillo. I had the pleasure of serving with him in the Trump administration, and I saw firsthand his fight to bring about democracy throughout Latin America, especially in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and in Venezuela. Not to ask you about the current administration, Ambassador, but regardless of what happens in November, there's going to be a new administration come January 20th. Can you give us your assessment of U.S. foreign policy towards the region? What can we expect, in your opinion, from a Trump administration or from a Harris administration as it relates to U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America? I think you're on mute. Ambassador, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that, Carlos. So it's going to be determined by who wins the election. I want to echo a sentiment that I keep hearing here about the attack on the independence and on institutions. And I see the two speakers from Mexico and from other countries talking about that. But I think it's important for a lot of the students in the audience and people in the audience to really reflect on the attack on American institutions. We constantly hear about this attack on the judiciary, a third independent branch of government. But here in America, we hear the same attacks on how we need to reform the Supreme Court because we don't like their outcomes. And I think it's very important to reflect because the Supreme Court is supposed to be independent by its nature and by its true independence, by being a true institution that is a block to the legislative and executive power. It has to have that full independence. It can't be manipulated by the executive or by the legislative power. So I think as the students see and hear these stories, that always make sense, right? Why don't we replace a justice or term limit them or change the structure or add additional ones? These changes are not meant to better the institutions, but rather to manipulate them, regardless of who's in power. And I think it's very important to always reflect on that. But regarding Latin American policy, and I can speak to a Trump administration having been in one, it's going to be much more predicated on strengthening the Americas. You look at post-COVID, I think the world saw a lot, right? And what the world really learned from a post-COVID world is you have to nearshore and you have to have vertical integration of critical infrastructure and ingredients and pharmaceuticals and others, right? And I think Latin America could perform an exceptional role in that nearshoring. But the hardest part in having represented clients in the private sector for nearshoring and encouraging businesses to reinvest in America is what you hear is the lack of rule of law. The people they don't want a certain outcome, they want independence, and they want a functioning judiciary in which their claims will be adjudicated impartially. And when you invest a lot of money, you see it in Mexico with a lot of American businesses, you've seen it in Panama, you've seen it in Guatemala, you've seen it across the entire region, obviously not to even speak of Cuba or Nicaragua, but you constantly see the lack of independence of the judiciary, which leads to the lack of confidence. But I'm hopeful that the next Trump administration will be much more driven by trade. Obviously, migration will be top of mind. Migration is a significant problem in this country. It's recognized by the majority of Americans as one of the most important problems in this country, probably second to only behind the economy. But if you look at trade, 2026 USMCA is renegotiated. CAFTA, DR, and a lot of these agreements are going to be renegotiated. So there's a real opportunity in a very short period for bilateral, trilateral agreements to be renegotiated, and they will be renegotiated within the next 18 months. I think that creates a significant opportunity for the United States to lead in the region, to continue to lead in the region, and also a significant opportunity for Latin America to encourage the nearshoring and friendshoring of jobs that have historically over the last 20 to 30 years been located in Asia. But it's all dependent on leadership. And I think one thing that I learned, at least in the last Trump administration, we were much more driven by people who wanted to work with the United States, not so much by ideology. Lopez Obrador is obviously a very complicated figure and complicated leader. President Trump is obviously another complicated leader and a difficult leader, but somehow they found a way to work to get a USMCA agreement that I think significantly benefited the economies of both countries. And I hope that's the case. Some countries are obviously very difficult, if not impossible, to work with. Nicaragua, for example, in my humble opinion, shouldn't be a member of any free trade agreement just based on their human rights record and the manipulation of all their processes in country. It's very difficult to engage in free trade with a country that's not free. So I think that should be one of the qualifications going forward. But in other countries, it shouldn't be based on ideology. It should be based on a win-win for the American taxpayer and also for the country at hand, and also in an economic but also a national security perspective.
I'm going to say something that might sound controversial. It really shouldn't be. I believe that when the U.S. Shows strong leadership, the world is a better place. And I think American foreign policy is not just about having the mightiest military in the world or the best economic system. It's about values. It's about promoting a way of thinking about democratic institutions, about free trade. And when that leadership is not there, then I think the world suffers. So I want to pose a question to everybody, and hopefully we can do this not just as a one-on-one, but as a conversation. What does the U.S. need to do to regain its leadership? Little by little, the Chinese are coming in, and they're eating our lunch. China is right now the #1 trading partner of almost every Latin American country. Mexico's an exception. The Dominican Republic's an exception. There are some exceptions, but by and large, it is the #1 trading partner of almost every Latin American country. Not to mention other countries around Africa and parts of Asia as well. As an American policymaker, in the case of Ambassador Trujillo, and as Latin American policymakers, what does the U.S. need to do to regain its leadership in the region? What would you like to see the U.S. do to once again become the partner of choice, not just of Mexico, not just of the Dominican Republic, but of every country in our hemisphere? Open it up to everybody. Go ahead, Ambassador.
Yeah, I'll chime in quickly, Carlos. If you look at the countries where we have a great trade relationship, it's based on bilateral, trilateral trade agreements. And I think that's the key to success. You mentioned the Dominican Republic, you mentioned Mexico, you mentioned Canada, you mentioned the Central American countries, you mentioned Colombia, obviously because of the military aid and counter-narcotics influence there. Those are countries where we have an advantage on trade over China or anyone else. But they're all driven by that bilateral or trilateral trade agreement. And that is, I think, the key for success. Argentina is a perfect example. Argentina has some of the largest lithium deposits in the world. Right now, they can't import that lithium to the United States. They have to send it to communist China. Why? It's very easy to have a bilateral trade agreement, which Argentina wants to open up their economy to the United States. The United States obviously could benefit from selling products to Argentina. Lithium is no longer being sourced to communist China, but coming to the United States. Argentina is procuring products that they're currently buying Far East, procuring them back in the hemisphere. But it takes leadership, and it takes the leadership to sit down and to analyze these problems, and it takes the people who are capable of understanding them, and a government who's willing to negotiate and lead. And I use Argentina just as a small example of how lithium or some of these other mineral resources want to come into the United States, benefit our country, but because of poor trade policy aren't able to.
Anybody else? Martin?
Well, clearly China is a common threat to all of Latin America and to the Americas. So there is where we should have a purpose all together in terms of how we bring the Americas together and stop the Chinese threat, because what you see in China investing in Latin America is just as they did in Africa, trying to take our natural resources and not bringing any value added. Even bringing Chinese workers to take out lithium, for example, in the golden triangle of Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. But clearly the question is, how do we build a cause throughout Latin America that could unite the three Americas? North America, Central America, and Latin America, no? And South America, I'm sorry. And I think that the key word, at least in terms of integration, is not only trade, but also infrastructure. Larry Summers had a very great example to speak about Chinese and American officials. And he said when...
Let me just mention, Larry Summers is the former Secretary of the Treasury and President of Harvard.
Exactly, thank you. Great academic fellow, and also a very strong policymaker, and very vocal also about US politics and US economics. No? He once said, when a Latin America meets a Chinese official, an American official, what he gets is an advice. When he meets a Chinese official, he gets a port, he gets a road, he gets a highway. So clearly the critical element is, how do we bring better infrastructure? Because you cannot have integration if you don't have physical and digital infrastructure. So the US, in my view, should use its financial institutions, particularly the IDB. The IDB is a phenomenal instrument that should have one key goal: building integration throughout the Americas, and also the US, as it was said very well in the case of lithium, trying to get doors for countries that don't have free trade agreements, but you have a Critical Minerals Act that can include Argentina in terms of the tax benefits that you get in the US for American companies investing in countries that have free trade agreements, but also countries that have critical minerals. So also, as it was said, leadership in critical minerals, leadership in also the energy transition process that the world is living, and building that kind of coalition. The concept that China is a threat not only to Latin America but also to the world, that's a cause to unite us, and the means should be digital and physical infrastructure, using the financial arms that the US has at the supranational level to bring that into fruition. And that hasn't been the case when you have gone beyond the US free trade agreement with Mexico and with Canada.
According to your question in relation what we would think of getting in addition from the United States, for me it's difficult to say, because I think Mexico has gotten most of what you would be asking. Maybe it's us that were able to convince United States to go into the trade agreement. We had a brilliant president with Salinas. Unfortunately, he was from the PRI, but he did a great move ahead. He proposed the trade agreement, and he negotiated it with US authorities and Canadian authorities, and we got it. That trade agreement now is reaching between Mexico and United States, just between the two of us, $1 trillion worth of exchange, of trading. No other formula implemented anywhere in the world has the size of what we have on that trade agreement. We export to United States much more than China, but at the same time, we import from United States dollar by dollar. So we export $1 and we buy $1 from United States. It's incredible what happened. Nobody thought that Mexico could be up to competing with the United States on the trade agreement, and we did it. Today, we export a little bit more to United States than what we import from. So we're accountable, for instance, for most of the farmers of the US Central and West on grain, wheat, sorghum. We buy from them huge amounts. Nobody else in the world buys so much from United States. And so we're accountable from them getting income and benefiting from Mexico's imports into our place. What's the difference? What we have there, whatever product or to produce a product, if it's labor intensive, Mexico takes the win. If it is technology or not so intense in labor, then US takes the lead. But we're very, very competitive. We're not the little guy on the backyard. And yet, we're still 20-1 in the border. You make $1 in the Mexican side, you just learn how to swim and cross the river, or you just learn how to jump walls, like the one Trump wanted to build. And if you learn that, you move from making $1 to making $20 from one day to the other one. That's an extremely powerful motive for people to migrate into United States. It's the price of success. That's the price you're paying for being so successful. The price Europe is paying for being so successful with all those migration flows coming from Africa and crossing the Mediterranean Sea. You were talking about 30% of Nicaraguans that have left the country and migrated. Same in Mexico. Same in Mexico all along this last 100 years. We have 40 million Mexicans in this nation, and really highly respected because they are highly productive, because they are very well structured to work, to learn, and to prosper. And they've done a great job here in the United States. So migration is a two-way street in United States and Mexico, because you take San Miguel de Allende, we have over 30,000 families, US families living in San Miguel de Allende. So it's a different migration, but it is there. But anyway, so what would I ask United States to do, or what we Mexicans should do to accomplish the dream of the Americas? It would be, again, education and universities. I just couldn't imagine what would happen if 50 of the greatest US universities would be operating in Mexico. Why is not that in NAFTA? Why is not that permitted? Because we don't accept it. It's so stupid, the behavior of our nation, that we don't accept to import high education. And that would be the greatest tool to change our countries if we just have that. Only with one disadvantage. We Latins don't like so much schooling and don't like so much being disciplined. We don't like so much being efficient at work. We'd rather say chistes and good stories than getting to work. Look at the Mexicans coming and crossing that border. there they never showed their strong capacity to progress in Mexico. Maybe because they didn't have the right boss who would orient them, who would train them, who would prepare them, as well as you do here in the United States. Our people came here without literacy, and yet they were well trained, they were well educated, and now they're very successful here. My aspiration and my second dream would be to bring those Mexicans back to Mexico. If we bring those 40 million that are here into Mexico, we would move ahead, we would prosper, I wouldn't have any doubt.
Thank you. We're running a little short on time. I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. I have a concluding question for them, but I'll do it after. So if you have any questions, just shout it out. Mateo.
Thank you guys very much for being here. My question has to do with immigration, just as we're on the topic. In this country 100 years ago, you didn't need a visa, you didn't need any papers to become an immigrant, and the country flourished tremendously. The biggest difference was that there wasn't social welfare, there wasn't unemployment benefits. So what is the...
Oh, there's the microphone. There we go.
Thank you. So what is the recipe, legal or political recipe, in order to capture the value of immigrants without making them be a political cost, in the sense that native citizens see their taxpayer dollars going to a new population that hasn't been in the country before?
Anybody want to take that one up?
The formula to me is the successful diasporas that we have here. Look at you Cubans. Jesus Christ, that is a miracle of success. Why? Because you came with education to this nation, which our migrants do not. Another diaspora very successful is the European wave through Ely Island. They came with education, and they are part of the success of this nation, if not great part of the success of this nation. Unfortunately, our Mexicans, our Nicaraguans, our people comes in here without the right level of education. So to me, again, that's the formula.
Congresswoman.
What's your name? Mateo.
Mateo's a student at FIU from Spain.
Ah, muy bien. Muchas gracias, Mateo. Bueno, ustedes tienen, en España tienen unos retos de migración mucho más fuertes que los nuestros. Por eso tenemos que resolverlos. Tenemos mayor deber por resolverlos entre Estados Unidos, México y entre las regiones. Lo voy a explicar en español porque para mí este tema es muy importante, porque todos los mexicanos tenemos un migrante, la mayoría lo tenemos sin documentos, la mayoría lo tenemos en Estados Unidos. En nuestra familia cercana, de manera cercana, en primer grado, bueno, en segundo grado y en tercero y en cuarto, todos lo tenemos. Yo no creo que podamos resolver los temas si no hay desarrollo en los dos pueblos, si no hay un desarrollo más o menos igual, con las diferencias naturales, pero que hubiera desarrollo y crecimiento económico. Desde el 2009 hasta hace un año, la migración con México era negativa. Eran más los que se regresaban que los que se iban. Hasta el año pasado. Y ese es un dato que han escondido. Pero ahora la migración es mayor, será cada vez mayor y más problemática en la medida que no se desarrollen los pueblos. Y por eso los países vecinos tenemos, y particularmente de esta región, tenemos que trabajar en el crecimiento económico. Y de ahí lo importante de los tratados de libre comercio, que me preocupa enormemente con esta falta de Estado de Derecho, con jueces electos que no creo que vayan a decir en su campaña que van a favorecer la justicia, sino que van a favorecer las empresas mexicanas. para ganarla, poder ganar una elección, por ejemplo, uno de los grandes daños que no se han visto que puede pasar, ya no digamos el ofrecimiento al crimen organizado, pero sí me preocupa mucho que cuando tú no resuelves en los países vecinos un desarrollo y un crecimiento económico, es difícil que resuelvas el migratorio. Félix tocó un tema que a mí me apasiona mucho y que lo toqué trabajé mucho mientras Felipe era presidente, que es Unaccompanied Migrant Children, que tenemos que trabajar por ahí. Yo creo que mucho de lo que trabajemos a través de la migración de los niños lo lograremos en los adultos, porque hay muchos principios que tienen que ver con reunificación familiar, que tienen que ver con interés superior de la niñez y que no tiene que ver con unas fronteras que la infancia y en sí mismas las familias pues pueden no importarle tanto. Pero vuelvo al tema económico, tenemos que crecer juntos. Y somos, bueno, yo soy más grande que tú, mi generación es la primera en recibir beneficios directos de la vecindad con Estados Unidos y se dejó de hablar en contra de Estados Unidos. Pero si nosotros dejamos de comercializar las cosas, acabamos terminando el Tratado de Libre Comercio, nos vamos a volver a convertir en enemigos y igual la migración todavía será mucho más dura, mucho más difícil y más nos va a distanciar entre los pueblos. Espero, Mateo, que con eso ya contestado algo.
Let's do one more question. Please say your name.
Hi, my name is Nyla, and this question is for President Fox. So I have a question regarding Mexico's newly elected president. What are your thoughts on Claudia Sheinbaum and the potential she has as president? Do you believe she has the qualities to fulfill a mandate strong for Mexico?
We all had doubts what would come next, or what we had for these last 6 years, which, by the way, is something we never hoped it would happen to Mexico, that we would have a populist president like it was happening throughout Latin America. And it happened. And even today, we don't believe it, but it happened. Now, Claudia, same thing, same exact thing. Up until now, any declaration she has made is exactly the same. But now said with a female face and not a man's face like it was with Lopez. Now things are being said with more dulzura, more sweet, with a smile. The other guy didn't ever smile. But the few ideas that Claudia has expressed is the same old thing. That's not what Mexico or any Latin American nation or any nation in the world needs. What we need is more pragmatism and less idealism. We still move by ideologies in Latin America, and I would even say that you move by ideologies here in the United States. Because he who is born Republican dies Republican. He who is born Democrat dies as a Democrat. You never accept that the other guy on the other side could be right or that has a great idea. So that divide is refraining our nations to really develop. That's why I like China, and I understand you don't like them here in the States. But China is a very pragmatic nation. It's the bottom line. It's profit. It's trading. It's producing. It's earning money. And they concentrate most of what they make in education and technology. They have narrowed that gap incredibly. So the only thing I'm saying is, let's stop being so ideological. And this is maybe the greatest sin in Latin America. It's ideology. We're talking about Milei. He might come up with a nice government, but who ensures him that the next president is going to follow his ideology? I doubt it. I really doubt it. I remember Nicaragua in the hands of the great presidents they had before. And I remember trying to sell the idea of the Puebla-Panama project, putting together the region of Mexico City, southern city, Puebla, all the way down to Panama. And what happened? Nothing. Because Nicaragua became extreme socialist, authoritarian, and a dictator. Because somebody else in the region says, I don't go along with it. I will never forget in Canada, in Quebec, where we met all the leaders of Latin American nations and the continent. President Bush was there. Imagine, President Bush came with the proposal. We learned until we were there to build up a continental trade agreement. All of the Americas, like the Bolivarian dream, as one nation, like we have the trade agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. President Bush proposed that. And guess who finished it? Your friend, Chavez. Chavez. He stood up and he made all those speaking for hours and hours, and everybody about was saying, ya cállate, Chavez. No chingues. Come si te vas, cabrón. Really, it's incredible how we waste opportunities, how we come on and destroy a good future that we would lay ahead. Only maybe Chile with that presence of the Chicago boys. As I said before, brought by a dictator, it worked. But the rest, we're so proud of ourselves. Claudia is saying today, nobody discovered America. We were here before they came in, the Spaniards. First of all, who cares about that? But she says, it's incredible. Why are we, and people like it, huh? That's the kind of the populist language that they use, popular slogans and popular stories, and but administrating the nation, living and respecting the independence of the central bank, which is the last resort that we still keep autonomous and independent, because our electoral institution, which was a citizens institution, totally independent from government, totally independent from public service, it was in hands of citizens. Now they took over. They took over Congress. They took over the judiciary now. Imagine, with the machinery of elections that they have, we are going to elect the judges. They are going to propose them, and certainly they're going to win. So now the judiciary and all the judges and the ministers are going to be in the hands of Morena. So again, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, that's where we're heading. And somebody said, what is United States going to do about this? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And we shouldn't be expecting United States to do something for us. We should do it ourselves. We, each Latin American country, with help of somebody else, but we should do it by our own. So we better start thinking differently from now on.
Thank you. We're good. So, good. We've heard a lot about the Chicago boys and their influential, their influence and their power over the economies of not just Latin America, but the world. I think pretty soon we're going to be hearing of the FIU boys and the FIU ladies who are going to have this influence and greater, hopefully. There we go. We have to conclude, but I do, before I ask a concluding question, I do want to ask if each of the fellows, in one sentence, could they tell us what they're going to be teaching the FIU leaders of the future? Just in one sentence, what your classes are going to be about. You're going to be here over the next couple of months. Ambassador Trujillo, you're going to be teaching about?
The case for nearshoring in the Americas, a look at all the opportunities of nearshoring.
Martin?
I'm going to be speaking about the challenges for the world economy, in particular focusing, starting from the US, and the challenges for the Federal Reserve in this new stage of lowering interest rates, and what does it mean to emerging economies, what does it mean to Latin America. I will deal in how do you manage a crisis from inside, looking at different experiences around the world and looking at the 2008, 2009. And I'm going to speak about also the opportunities. Again, there's been many missed opportunities that Latin America have. Clearly, I see opportunities in 3 areas, and I'm going to speak about energy transition in the world and what are the countries that are better prepared for energy transition and what do we need in order to develop energy transition in the Americas. We spoke briefly about lithium, about copper, about minerals. How do we integrate all that where China has already an advantage in basically electromobility? How do we bring that into the Americas? We're going to speak about energy security and liquid natural gas, how that could make a critical element in energy transition. And we're going to speak about food security and how the world needs the food that is produced in Latin America and how we can sell it to the rest of the world. So basically, challenges for the world economy, how do we interpret it in Latin America, how do we deal with crisis, and what are the opportunities out there for the region moving forward.
That's awesome. That's a long sentence.
We Latins.
First, you are, and then you do. First, you have purpose, and then you perform. So it's leadership at the very end. To students, to me, the best lesson that we can give to them, equip yourselves as a successful person. The rest will come by itself. So that's what I'm going to be speaking about, maybe the 8 sessions that I'm going to take until boom.
Thank you. Congresswoman. Félix.
I will be teaching Democracy Unplugged, Global Democratic Ecosystem, so I hope that in the next few weeks I will trigger your interest in becoming a global pro-democracy activist, a freedom fighter. I will teach practical skills on becoming an activist, particularly focused on youth activism.
Thank you. Lo estaba escribiendo ya en inglés. Se trata de entendernos más a través de nuestra historia, a través de los liderazgos de nuestra historia, para ver los retos que vienen en términos políticos, por supuesto, en sentido amplio y sobre todo en términos de liderazgo. Serán tiempos de valientes, así es que vámonos preparándonos bien. Gracias.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you the concluding question, hopefully only one sentence. We began this discussion talking about why you got into public service. What inspired you to be a public servant? We have a room full of young, aspiring public servants, hopefully. In your classes, you're going to have many, many students who might be thinking, why do I want to get involved in this, right? You were jailed for 21 months. You've been, all of you, criticized extensively for everything you do, everything you don't do. When you read the paper, when you watch the news, you hear all the negativity, all the division, all the bitterness, everything that's wrong with politics. Yet, you have shown that you can do a lot of good in the world by being a public servant. Why should the students, why should the people listening make that jump and become public servants? Ambassador?
I think it's very important to be part of the solution and to be active in the process. If not, it's very, very difficult to criticize it.
Martin?
Basically, if you want to make change happen, I mean, you can be in the private sector and have change for the company that you work with in a very small environment. If you want to bring change to your country, you have to get into public service.
Félix.
I think there are very few activities in life in which you can impact so many people and work for the greater good, as you said. And through public service, we can exercise, I'll use a word that is not very popular in politics, you can exercise love and compassion through politics.
Congresswoman.
A mí me parece que la política es el único camino que tenemos para darnos la mano, para convivirnos, para convivir, para crecer, para ser más solidarios. Y es precisamente en estos retos en los que estamos. Quienes creemos en la política, vamos a creer en las reglas, en el Estado de Derecho y también en el sentido solidario de todos nuestros pueblos. Sean políticos, ahí los necesitamos.
Mr. President.
Shortcut to happiness is being for others, is being in politics.
Thank you. Now you can tell why I'm so excited to have these amazing public servants over the next couple of months. They're going to be teaching, they're going to be holding office hours, they're going to be mentoring, they're going to be here for you. So please help me send them off to our next activity by giving them a warm round of applause. This is the first time we have a fellow from Nicaragua. This is the first time we have a fellow from Mexico, and we have two, and hopefully 3 with the First Lady who will join in the class once in a while. So we have had Argentines and we have had Americans, of course, but I'm really honored that they have accepted our offer. They're going to be here for you for the next couple of months, and I encourage you to keep on coming to our activities. The next one is tomorrow when we launch the 4th edition of the Index of Bureaucracy. We're going to have a conversation with scholars who conducted the study, who are going to tell you why bureaucratic burdens stifle economic growth. President Fox is going to join us for a conversation as well, and this is going to be one of many events that we're going to be holding over the next couple of months. So thank you again.